Okay, I divided section 2 up into two different videos because when we start talking about our brain regions, cerebral hemispheres is included in section 2, which has three components: the cerebral cortex, white matter, and basal nuclei. This is going to be the heaviest content is in this section, so I didn't want you to have a 45-minute long video. So when we're talking about, again, what do you need to know, your worksheets that you have, I believe there's two of them, I have made tables for you. And when it talks about function of these areas, you want to take the words that are coming from this lecture and or the slides. Don't go into your textbook because it's going to be overwhelming and confusing. So let's start with the cerebral cortex, which is, again, one of our components of our first brain region, which is cerebral hemispheres. So the cerebral cortex is what we consider our executive suite of our entire nervous system or brain. Why? It's because it is our conscious mind. It's what we consider our conscious. So it allows us to perceive and be aware, have sensory perception, voluntary motor initiation. So for skeletal muscle that we talked about previously, allows us to kind of communicate, store memories, and understand kind of what's going on. What is it composed of? Neuron cell bodies. So we do have billions of these. Dendrites, glial cells, blood vessels, but no axons. The cerebral cortex composes about 40% of our brain mass. Couple things to think about when we're talking about the cerebral cortex as a whole. It does have three different functional areas, which we're about to walk through. When we're talking about our motor areas, those control our voluntary movement. We also have sensory areas that allow us to be aware of all the sensations, and association areas that kind of bring in all of this information that's coming in. Another thing, each of the hemispheres is concerned with the contralateral or opposite side of the body. So if we're talking about our right cerebral hemisphere that typically controls the left side of our body, our left cerebral hemisphere will control the right side of our body. So that's contralateral. Lateralization is another term. This is also referred to as specialization of cortical function, can only occur in one hemisphere. So even though our cerebral hemispheres look completely identical from the naked eye, their functions are different, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Conscious behavior is going to involve the entire cortex in one way or another. There's no functional area of the cortex that acts alone. We are talking about each specific area within the cortex and what its individual function is. But again, just remember that it's not just that specific area. We really need communication throughout our entire cerebral cortex in order for anything to actually happen. So let's start with our motor areas. These are located in the posterior part of our frontal lobe, and the motor areas are going to control, again, we're talking about voluntary movement. There's 4 specific motor areas that you need to be aware of what they're responsible for. Here's just an image that you can go in and take a look at if we're talking about our motor areas. And then here's our 4. You do not need to know where they're located for lecture or lab, but just to give you kind of an idea for different parts of our brain, what they're responsible for. Okay, our first primary motor area is going to be our primary somatic motor cortex. We're talking about, I don't care about the location again, we're talking about function. So primary somatic motor cortex, this is going to allow us to have conscious control of precise, skilled skeletal muscle movements. So this is what you are wanting to write down on your worksheet and kind of know for your lecture exam. The premotor cortex, this is going to help with planning our movement. So it kind of acts as a staging area for more complex tasks. So it's going to help control learned, repeating or pattern motor skills, something like playing a piano or texting on your phone. It also is going to help coordinate simultaneous or sequential actions. It's also going to control voluntary actions that depend on sensory feedback. So, a good example of this when we would use our premotor cortex is if we were walking into a dark room and trying to locate a light switch. The third area is your Broca's area. I know we're talking about these being present in both cerebral hemispheres. This is kind of our exception. It's thought that the Broca's area only resides in one hemisphere, and it's usually going to be the left hemisphere. But this area is going to be responsible for our speech, directing muscles for speech production, and helping plan our speech and voluntary motor activities. Our fourth area, if we're talking about the motor cortex, is going to be our frontal eye field. And again, we're talking about voluntary movement, so it's going to control our voluntary eye movements. So those were our four motor areas. Now we're moving on to our sensory areas. There is a lot more sensory areas than there are motor areas. So we have 8 specific sensory areas that we're going to cover. So the first one is your primary somatosensory cortex. It's going to receive general sensory information from sensory receptors that we have in our skin, as well as proprioceptors. And proprioceptors are in our skeletal muscle, our joints, and our tendons. And these receptors help determine our body's position in space. So it's getting information from 2 different sensors. So skin receptors and proprioceptors. And the neurons in this area are capable of spatial discrimination, meaning that they're able to tell which region of our body is actually being stimulated, not just, that we're getting this sensory information coming in. The next one is going to be our somatosensory association cortex, and this is going to integrate sensory information input, so things like temperature and pressure, from our primary somatosensory cortex to help us understand the object. So we can determine things like the size of the object, the texture of the object, and relationship of the parts of the object that are actually being felt. So for example, this area would be helping you if you were to put your hand in your pocket. You would be using your somatosensory association cortex to help retrieve some stored memories that you have, so you can kind of perceive the objects that you're feeling in your pocket. For example, like a piece of gum, your car keys, your cell phone, a pen, something like that. If somebody has damage to the somatosensory association cortex and they put their hand in their pocket to try to feel for what's in there, and they had damage in this specific area, they would not be able to determine what object it is without actually looking at it. Okay, our visual areas, we have 2. We have our primary visual area, and this is going to receive visual information directly from our retinas. And then we have our visual association area, and this is going to use past visual experiences to help interpret visual stimuli, for example, color, form, or movement. And this area is also going to be responsible for us being able to recognize faces. We also have 2 auditory areas. So the primary auditory area is going to help us interpret information from the inner ear as pitch, loudness, and location. We're going to use our auditory association area to store memories of sound and permit perception of sound stimulus. So for example, we can recognize specific sounds. So like thunder, we recognize as thunder. Fireworks, we recognize as fireworks. Speech, we can recognize that somebody's talking, things like that. Our vestibular cortex is really our balance area, so it's responsible for determining the position of our head in space. And then we have our olfactory cortex, and this is more specifically referred to as our primary olfactory cortex, which is involved in our conscious awareness of odors. Our gustatory cortex, this is involved in our perception of taste. And then we have our visceral sensory area. This is going to be the conscious perception of our visceral sensations. So this allows us to kind of perceive that maybe we have an upset stomach after eating something we shouldn't have, or if we need to use the restroom because our bladder is full. The last thing we need to talk about for the cerebral cortex is the multimodal association areas. So these areas aren't just kind of getting information from something specific like the receptors in our skin. Instead, they're receiving input from multiple sensory areas, and they're sending out information to multiple areas. So that's why we call them multimodal association areas. So it allows us to give meaning to the information that we're receiving, allows us to kind of store some of it in memory, and we're able to make connections by tying information that we're bringing in to the memories that we had. And therefore, we're able to decide on what action our body is going to take based off of this. So basically, sensations, thoughts, and emotions become conscious, and it kind of makes us who we are. We can divide the multimodal association areas into 3 parts. So we have our anterior association area, our posterior association area, and then our limbic association area. So our anterior association area is also called the prefrontal cortex. This is going to be our most complicated region that we have because it's involved in complicated processes like our intellect, cognition, which is going to include complex learning abilities, recall, and our personality as well. It does contain a working memory, which we actually need for abstract ideas, judgment, reasoning, persistence, and planning. So our development of this area is actually going to depend on feedback from our social environment. Again, this area is kind of making us who we are. Our posterior association area is going to play a role in recognizing patterns in faces and helping localize us in space. It's also going to be involved in written and spoken language, so Wernicke's area, which we'll talk about later in this chapter. Our third component is our limbic association area. So this area is going to be part of our limbic system, and this is kind of our emotional area. So it's going to provide emotional impact that makes it seem important to us and helps establish memories. So we mentioned earlier a little bit about lateralization of cortical functioning. Lateralization means that each of the hemispheres, even though they look physically identical, have very different functions. So there is a division of labor. We have what's referred to as cerebral dominance. So one of our hemispheres is better at something than the other hemisphere. So when we're talking about cerebral dominance, we're referring to the hemisphere that is dominant for language, math, and logic. If you are a right-handed person, typically you have left-sided dominance. If you are a left-handed person, you typically have right-handed dominance. So what is the division of labor when we're talking about our hemispheres? Our left hemisphere is usually dominant in controlling language, math, and logic, while our right hemisphere is involved more in our intuition, emotion, artistic, and musical skills. Okay, so that was everything covering our cerebral cortex. Let's move on to our white matter, and then finally we'll have our basal nuclei. So when we're talking about white matter, remember we're talking about actual axons of neurons. So we're talking about communication. So the white matter is responsible for communicating between all of the different areas, the cerebral areas, as well as sending information to the cortex and lower areas or regions in the central nervous system. White matter, as a reminder, we're talking about myelinated fibers that contain fat, which makes it appear white anyways. So the white matter fibers, they are classified based on the direction that the fibers are running. So yes, you need to know this. This is really all you need to know about the white matter component of our cerebral hemispheres. So if we're talking about the association fibers, these are horizontally running fibers that are help connecting information and sending information within the same hemisphere. Our commissural fibers, these are also horizontal fibers, but these are sending information and connecting both cerebral hemispheres. So sending information from one hemisphere to the other hemisphere. And then we have projection fibers, and these are going to be running vertically. And these connect hemispheres, both hemispheres, to the lower brain and even the spinal cord. So allow us to send information vertically within our central nervous system. So here's just an image. If we're talking about our association fibers, those are in pink. So we're only going to be sending information within one hemisphere. If we're talking about our commissural fibers, these are green ones. So if we look here, they're running between the two hemispheres. So we're sending informations between our left and right hemisphere with these fibers. And then we have our projection fibers in purple, which are sending information to different parts within our central nervous system. The last thing we need to talk about in relation to the cerebral hemispheres is the basal nuclei. You do not need to worry about this. I should have cut that. You don't need to know the three basic regions, or you don't need to know what the basal nuclei include. I just really want you to understand the function. So even though they're really, really small, they have huge functions, or thought to have huge functions, which include influencing our muscle movements, playing a role in cognition and emotion. They help regulate intensity of slow or stereotype movements. What is a stereotype movement? Things like if we're walking and we're swinging our arms, we don't even realize that. The basal nuclei will help regulate the intensity or frequency of our arms moving on either side of us while we're walking. They also help filter out incorrect or inappropriate responses and inhibit antagonistic or unnecessary movements. So a really good way to kind of understand movement-wise what the basal nuclei function is that if you know somebody with Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease, what their motions look like, that is because their basal nuclei are not functioning correctly. So they don't have the smooth fluidity of movements that we typically see because of damage to this area.